Amid the ferocious winds and blinding snow, one man huddles in the heart of the Rockies, his only hope for survival a fire he's kept burning for weeks. But the storm that's now sweeping through the mountains may be more than his shelter can withstand unless his hidden fire pit holds the secret to life and death. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're moved by stories like this, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale will leave you in awe. The fire flickered weakly as Jack Harlan adjusted the log that seemed to strain under the weight of the blizzard's fury. Outside, the storm raged like a beast unleashed, howling through the tall pines, its icy fingers clawing at the log cabin's walls. Jack knelt by the hearth, his hands rough and worn, the scarred leather of his gloves creaking as he prodded the embers. A small, jagged iron rod was his tool, a work of necessity, like everything in this forsaken land. The fire pit he'd built was unlike any he'd seen before, and it had served him well for the past few months. As snow drifted through the cracks in the cabin's door, Jack couldn't help but wonder how long his luck would hold. Winter was an unforgiving master in the Rockies. Every night, Jack felt it creep closer, gnawing at his bones, reminding him of the thin line he walked. He'd seen men die here, good men, who had taken all the right steps, done everything they could, and still found themselves swallowed by the wilderness. It had taken him years to perfect his fire pit design, a system so hidden, so perfectly integrated into the structure of his cabin that it would be invisible to any who might come looking. Yet, tonight, the storm seemed to mock his efforts. Jack let out a sigh, the weight of his solitude pressing against his chest. The fire pit's stone lip, where he carefully laid the kindling, was nearly full, yet the warmth it gave was meager compared to what was needed. His eyes flicked to the heavy wooden door, half covered by the drifting snow. How much longer before the storm broke through? How much longer before the hunger, the cold, and the isolation took their toll? With a final adjustment to the fire, Jack stood and moved to the window, peering out at the darkened wilderness. The storm was relentless. He could feel it creeping up on him. He hadn't seen anyone in days, maybe weeks. His closest neighbor, a fellow trapper, lived nearly a day's travel away, but even that seemed like an eternity in this kind of weather. It wasn't just the cold that worried Jack, it was what came with it. The mountain knew no mercy. His fire pit, a clever and secretive design that had saved his life more than once, could very well be the only thing standing between him and the end. The storm outside wasn't just a weather event, it was a reminder of nature's dominance. Jack had survived 7 winters in the Rockies, each one colder, more brutal than the last. He'd built this cabin, these walls, the fire pit, all with the hope of one thing: survival. The years had taught him that survival wasn't a matter of hope. It was a matter of preparation, of understanding the land, and of accepting that death waited just outside the door. Tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Each gust of wind seemed to scrape across the cabin like claws on stone, rattling the timbers and seeping into the walls. Jack had always known the winters here would be harsh, but this was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The kind of storm that didn't just threaten life, it demanded it. The fire pit, nestled cleverly beneath the floorboards of the cabin, remained hidden from sight unless one knew where to look. Jack had designed it after months of trial and error, adapting techniques he'd learned from the old mountain men, those who'd lived and died in these wilds before him. His design was simple but genius. A narrow stone-lined trench, sealed beneath the wooden floor, funneled the heat from the fire upwards into the cabin's heart. He'd even devised a method of ventilation that circulated the warm air evenly throughout the small space, eliminating cold spots that could spell disaster when temperatures dropped. As Jack stoked the fire, the warmth slowly crept up his legs, filling the small cabin with the kind of heat that allowed him to breathe deeply for the first time in hours. The storm's fury seemed a distant thing now, though he knew it wouldn't be long before it tested him again. He moved to the wooden chest against the wall, pulling out his rifle and checking its load with practiced ease. The rifle was his second lifeline. The first was the fire pit. But a man couldn't live on warmth alone. He needed food, tools, and above all patience. Time was the enemy out here. Jack was no stranger to the isolation of the Rockies. He'd spent years learning to navigate the wilderness, understanding its rhythms, its unspoken rules. But the mountain was indifferent to human survival. It would take its toll when it was good and ready. The wind howled once more, shaking the cabin's frame as the fire crackled on. Jack knelt by the fire pit, pushing a log into the flames. The heat from the fire felt like a small miracle against the bitterness of the night. But Jack knew better than to take comfort in that. As much as he relied on this fire, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Tomorrow, the storm would continue. Tomorrow, the cold would press closer. Tomorrow, the mountain would test him once again. But tonight, his fire pit held strong, its warmth a quiet victory in the heart of the storm. The storm's howl echoed through the trees, but inside Jack's cabin, the crackling fire was a steady companion, its glow casting long shadows against the walls. The warmth from the hidden fire pit spread throughout the room, the heat clinging to his bones like a comfort he hadn't known in years. But it wasn't enough to silence the gnawing feeling in his chest. Jack stared into the flames, his mind drifting back to the past. He had built this cabin, this fire pit, out of necessity, but it was also built from the ghosts of men who had come before him, the old trappers, the rugged souls who had braved the Rockies in search of fortune, or simply to survive. He'd learned from their mistakes, their triumphs, and their failures, all of which whispered through the mountain air like a song he could never quite escape. There was one man who came to mind often, Caleb Hunt, a trapper who had lived in these mountains long before Jack had arrived. Caleb's cabin, much like Jack's, had been built with ambition, an ambition to withstand the worst of what nature could throw at it. But unlike Jack's, Caleb's cabin had fallen to a bare, the force of the attack too much for the worn-down structure to handle. It was an old story, one Jack had heard from more than one survivor, but it had stayed with him. The mountain could take anyone, no matter how prepared they were. Jack had come across Caleb's cabin one spring while scouting for a new trapping ground. The structure was half-rotted, the logs splintered and scarred from years of exposure. It was clear that Caleb had built his shelter with care, yet nature had worked its slow, relentless hand on it. Jack had spent hours there, searching for answers. The story of Caleb's downfall haunted him that day and still lingered in his mind. He had vowed to himself, right then, that he would never make the same mistake. His cabin had to be different, stronger. With that memory, the weight of his isolation seemed to press harder on Jack's chest. In the back of his mind, he could still hear Caleb's voice, warning him of the risks of living in such a harsh land. Yet, Jack had never been one to back down from a challenge. The fire pit he'd created was proof of that, an innovation born from the lessons of the past, tempered with his own ingenuity. As the wind continued to rage outside, Jack turned back to his fire. It had taken countless days and nights of trial and error to perfect the pit, but now, in the face of the worst storm he'd ever seen, it was more than a source of warmth. It was his lifeline. And with each passing minute, the storm outside only seemed to deepen its fury, as if it, too, sought to challenge him. But Jack was resolute. He wasn't ready to let this mountain claim him, not today. He had learned too much from the ghosts of the past to let them win. Hours passed, and the storm outside only seemed to grow more violent. The wind roared, shaking the logs of the cabin as the snow piled up in drifts against the walls. Inside, the warmth from Jack's fire pit was like a small island of comfort in the middle of a world turned hostile. Yet, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the true test of his survival was only just beginning. The fire's glow danced across the walls, casting eerie shadows in every corner of the room. Jack sat in silence, his eyes locked on the flames, his thoughts focused on the fragile balance between life and death in this unforgiving land. The fire pit had been his invention, something that had taken countless hours to perfect, and tonight it would be tested like never before. The cold seeped in from the cracks in the door and windows. Despite the fire's warmth, Jack's cabin, like all the others in these mountains, had been built to endure, but there were limits. He had learned that much during his years of trapping. A man could only push nature so far before it pushed back. Suddenly, the howl of the storm outside intensified, as if a new force had joined the blizzard's wrath. Jack's attention snapped to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that rested beside him. His breath hitched as he waited, listening for any sign of what could be out there. A loud, guttural noise echoed through the air, sharp and heavy. It was followed by another, closer this time. Jack stood up, the movement swift and silent, as if years of living in these mountains had made him more instinct than man. He moved toward the door, his rifle in hand, but the strange noise persisted. It was a thump, a scraping sound. The storm had intensified, but it wasn't the wind that was causing this new noise. His mind raced, considering all the possibilities. It was then that the realization struck him. The bear. The storm had driven it out of the mountains, and now it was looking for shelter. His hand tightened around the rifle as he stepped quietly toward the door, his body tense with readiness. The fire in the pit flickered wildly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was a warm light, but in this moment it felt far too distant, as if the mountain had become something far larger than the man who dared to challenge it. With each passing second, the noise outside grew louder. There was no more time to wonder. Jack knew he had to act fast, but his instincts told him something else. The fire, his hidden fire pit, was no longer just a source of warmth. It was now his greatest weapon. But would it be enough to withstand the storm and the beast that prowled outside? Jack swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing. The test had begun. The wind howled louder, a relentless roar that seemed to push at the very fabric of Jack's cabin. He stood by the door, rifle in hand, watching the shadows stretch long across the cabin's walls. The fire's light flickered, its glow casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with the storm's fury outside. The noise from beyond the door grew more distinct now. It was the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood, a slow, methodical process, as if the creature outside was carefully testing the structure, probing for weaknesses. Jack's breath quickened. He knew what it was. The mountain had come for him. It wasn't just the cold that had driven the grizzly closer, it was hunger. Jack had seen it before. When the snow piled high, the animals grew desperate. The bear was likely starving, struggling to find enough food in the unforgiving wilderness. But tonight, it had found more than it bargained for. The old, weathered cabin was no match for a grizzly's sheer strength, but the fire pit, the clever, hidden pit Jack had engineered, was something else entirely. He moved quietly through the cabin, checking the small gun ports he'd built into the walls. These narrow slits allowed him to see outside without ever opening the door. The snowstorm made visibility poor, but the outline of the bear's massive form was unmistakable against the white landscape. The beast paced in slow, deliberate circles around the cabin, its heavy paws leaving deep prints in the snow. Jack knew he couldn't wait much longer. If the bear grew frustrated enough, it would attack. Bears didn't hesitate when they were desperate, but Jack wasn't about to give it the satisfaction of taking him down so easily. He turned back to the fire pit, crouching beside it and feeding another log into the flames. The pit, hidden beneath the floorboards, was the heart of the cabin's defense. Its design had been born from desperation, from a need to survive. Its hidden location allowed the heat to spread evenly throughout the cabin, but more importantly, it made it difficult for any predator to identify its source. Jack had considered every angle, every possible threat. The fire itself, he realized, was not just a tool for warmth. It was his lifeline, a constant, steady force that could outlast the storm, outlast the bear. He had designed the pit so that even in the dead of winter, it could burn continuously for days, keeping the cabin warm and deterring any animal from getting too close. But tonight, the fire wasn't just about survival, it was about battle. He slid his rifle over his shoulder and moved to the window. He could feel the temperature drop even further, as the storm continued to rage outside, the cold seeping in through every crack in the door. His cabin had held strong, but that wouldn't matter if the bear was determined enough. The storm intensified, the wind rattling the walls with greater force. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he peered through the narrow opening in the wall. The bear had stopped pacing. Now, it was standing on its hind legs, sniffing the air, its massive body blocking the faint light from outside. Jack held his breath. The next move was critical. If he made a sound, the bear might charge. If he didn't act quickly, the cabin might not hold. He glanced once more at the fire pit, then back at the beast. There was only one thing left to do. He turned, grabbed a shovel, and slowly approached the fire. He had a plan, and it would only work if he had the courage to execute it. The bear's presence outside had reached a new intensity. The rhythmic scraping of claws against the wood had stopped, replaced by the unnerving silence of a predator that was waiting. Jack's pulse raced as he stood beside the fire pit, the heat from the flames creating a small oasis of warmth in the otherwise freezing cabin. But he didn't feel safe, not yet. The storm outside continued to howl with fury, a cold wind sweeping through the cracks in the cabin's walls, making the air inside feel as biting as the wilderness beyond. Jack took a deep breath and refocused on his plan. If there was a chance to drive the bear away without a fight, it was now. He had spent years developing the fire pit, but he'd never intended it for something like this. The cabin's unique design had never been tested by such a direct threat. The fire pit itself was a marvel of survival ingenuity, a narrow stone-lined trench running beneath the floorboards, creating a heat trap that could be sustained for days. Jack's design was meant to conserve fuel while maintaining warmth, and, with the right conditions, the temperature inside could easily surpass the freezing point, even in the harshest storms. But the bear wasn't just a threat to the warmth of the cabin, it was a threat to his very life. The problem with grizzlies was that they weren't easily deterred. Most mountain men built crude defenses against wildlife. Simple doors, crude locks, or even traps. Jack had built his fire pit into the structure of the cabin itself, its heat radiating through the wood and stone in such a way that it wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a subtle, constant reminder that Jack was prepared for anything. He had one advantage, one secret that few men in the mountains had thought to use: smoke. If he could drive the bear away with the smoke from his fire, he might have a chance to escape the storm with his life. Jack wasn't naive. He knew that a bear would fight if it felt cornered, and he wasn't about to wait for the creature to make the first move. He quickly went to work. With the shovel in hand, Jack cleared a small patch of the floor near the fire pit, making space for a controlled fire. His heart raced as he removed the stone covering, exposing the embers below. Carefully, he began feeding the flames, adjusting the angle of the fire to direct the smoke up through the cabin's small chimney. The air thickened with smoke as Jack worked quickly, knowing that if the bear could smell it, it would be confused, hopefully frightened, too. Bears weren't fans of smoke, and Jack hoped the smell would drive the creature away. The bear's shadow loomed near the window again, blocking out the dim light. Jack clenched his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. His hands were steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. He knew that his fire pit, if properly vented, could create enough smoke to force the bear to retreat. But it had to be just the right amount. The last thing he wanted was to suffocate himself in the process. The cabin filled with thick smoke, a heavy cloud that filled the room. Jack felt the weight of the moment on him. As the smoke poured up and out, Jack could hear the unmistakable sound of the bear sniffing the air, followed by a low, guttural growl. It was enough. The bear had detected the smoke. For a brief, tense moment, Jack held his breath, praying that the bear would retreat. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation. There was too much to lose. Then, through the thick haze, he heard it. The bear turned, its claws scraping against the snow as it lumbered away. Jack exhaled, the tension in his chest lifting ever so slightly. The storm was still fierce, but for now, he was safe. The fire pit had worked. The storm raged on through the night, but inside Jack's cabin, the warmth from the fire pit was a steady comfort against the fury of the wilderness. He stood by the window, his eyes straining against the blizzard's white noise, but the bear was gone. For now, the danger had passed. The smoke he'd created had done its job, driving the beast away, but Jack knew better than to assume he was safe. The wilderness had a way of testing men, pushing them until they broke. And tonight, Jack had been tested as few were. The fire crackled in the pit beneath the floor, its orange glow dancing in the dim light. Jack sat back down, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline of the last few hours. The storm outside continued to batter the cabin, but inside, the warmth of the fire was a comforting reminder that he was still alive. Yet, the relief was fleeting. Jack couldn't afford to be complacent. The bear's visit was just a reminder of how fragile life could be in these mountains. He had learned that lesson well over the years. Survival wasn't about just having the right tools, the right fire pit, or the right shelter. It was about the ability to adapt, to think quickly, and to outlast whatever nature could throw at him. And tonight, Jack had passed the test. He thought of Caleb Hunt again, the trapper whose cabin had fallen to a bear's attack. Jack had always admired Caleb's knowledge of the land, his ingenuity, and his tenacity. But in the end, Caleb had underestimated the mountain. It was a mistake Jack wouldn't make. The fire pit, his hidden defense, was his way of outsmarting the wilderness. He had learned from the failures of others, and built his cabin with the lessons of survival in mind. But even the best preparations could be tested by the brutal forces of nature. Jack rose from his seat, moving toward the fire pit to check on the embers. The heat it generated was more than enough to keep the cabin warm, but the storm outside would continue to press against him, testing every aspect of his shelter. He had designed the fire pit to last, to burn steadily without the need for constant maintenance. It was the heart of his survival strategy, a quiet force that would burn through the worst storms and the darkest nights. But tonight, it wasn't just the fire that had kept him safe. It was his ability to think on his feet, to use the tools at his disposal to outwit a bear that could easily have torn his cabin apart. He had created this place not just to survive but to fight back. As Jack stoked the fire once more, he felt a deep, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. The storm outside was fierce, but in here, he was safe for now. The fire pit had protected him, but Jack knew that in the wilderness, nothing could be taken for granted. There would always be another storm, another challenge, another test. And he would face each one with the same determination that had gotten him this far. The hours stretched on, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The snow continued to fall in thick, swirling blankets, while the wind howled like a beast circling its prey. Jack sat by the fire, the warmth from the pit washing over him as he tried to steady his thoughts. The bear had been driven off, but Jack knew that this was just the beginning. In the mountains, survival was an endless cycle, each day another battle. He had spent years learning the rhythms of this place, understanding its patterns. He knew how to read the weather, how to track animals, how to find his way when the trail had been buried under feet of snow. But there were still things that eluded him, things that didn't show up on a map or in a guidebook. The wilderness was full of secrets, each one waiting to be uncovered in its own time. Jack had learned that the hard way. As he sat by the fire, Jack's mind wandered to the deeper threats that lurked just beyond the edge of his cabin. Bears, wolves, storms, they were all tangible, visible dangers. But there were other threats, ones that were harder to quantify. The isolation of the mountains had a way of wearing down a man's mind. The longer you stayed out here, the more the silence pressed in on you, the more the wilderness made you feel small and insignificant. The quiet was often louder than the storm. Jack had seen it before, trappers who had spent too many seasons alone, their minds fraying at the edges. He'd met men who had gone mad in the wilderness, who had lost track of time, of reality, until they were nothing more than ghosts in the woods. The mountains had a way of consuming those who weren't prepared, who couldn't handle the isolation, the constant struggle. And Jack knew that the greatest danger wasn't the cold or the bears, it was what happened inside a man's head when he spent too long on his own. The fire crackled in the pit, a comforting sound that reminded Jack he was still grounded, still connected to something solid. But even the fire couldn't dispel the growing sense of unease that had settled in his gut. The bear wasn't the only enemy he had to face. The wilderness had a way of testing not just a man's body, but his spirit. He rose from his seat, moving to the window once more. The storm still raged outside, but there was no sign of the bear. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkened landscape. His cabin, though well constructed, was still vulnerable. The storm had driven the bear off, but it had also made him vulnerable to other threats, ones that weren't as obvious, but just as dangerous. The enemy wasn't always something you could see. Sometimes, it was the slow erosion of your resolve, the gradual wearing down of your mind as you fought to stay alive. And as the storm howled outside, Jack knew that his battle wasn't just with the wilderness. It was with himself. As dawn finally broke over the snow-choked peaks of the Rockies, Jack stood at the window staring into the gray-white expanse beyond his cabin. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered like a shadow, thick and heavy, hanging over the land. He could feel the bite of the cold even inside the cabin, the kind that only the high mountains could deliver. His fire pit had held steady, keeping the cabin warm, and the worst of the bear's threat had passed. Yet Jack felt a gnawing unease deep in his gut. The wilderness had a way of tricking men, of giving them just enough time to believe they were safe before the real danger came. Jack's gaze shifted to the edge of the small clearing around his cabin, where the storm had left behind a blanket of snow, pristine and untouched. It was beautiful, serene, almost, but it was a deceptive beauty, a beauty that could mask the lurking dangers beneath. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night before. The bear had come close, but it hadn't broken through. The fire pit had kept him alive, yet there was no guarantee the next threat would be so easily dismissed. Survival was a relentless game, one where the stakes grew higher each day, and Jack had no illusions about the cost. If his fire pit had held the night before, would it hold tomorrow? Would it hold the next storm? The mountain wasn't done with him, yet he knew that. He moved away from the window, the weight of the realization settling heavily on his shoulders. The mountain was a place of both beauty and danger, and while Jack had learned to outsmart it in small ways, there was no escaping its unpredictability. He might be safe for now, but that could change in the blink of an eye. Jack took one last look around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the fire pit. He had built this place to withstand the worst the wilderness had to offer, but nothing in these mountains came without a price. He had survived last night, but the mountain had more tests ahead. With a final, steady breath, Jack turned and walked toward the door. The storm had passed, but the true test, he knew, was yet to come. The world outside had calmed, but Jack's mind remained restless. He had faced the storm and the bear, both of which had tried to take him. Yet here he stood, on the threshold of his cabin, staring out into the vast, snow-covered wilderness, knowing that his battle was far from over. The mountain was quiet now, but the silence felt like the calm before the next storm. Jack had learned, over the years, that survival was never a guarantee. It was a series of choices, made in moments of extreme pressure, where the wrong decision could mean the difference between life and death. He had built his fire pit with every intention of using it to survive the long winters and unpredictable dangers of the Rockies, but he now realized that it was more than just a tool. It was a symbol, one that represented his refusal to succumb to the mountain's harshness. It was his defiance against nature's unforgiving hand. As Jack walked away from his cabin, his footsteps crunching through the fresh snow, he thought of all the others who had come before him, the mountain men who had been swallowed by the wilderness, their cabins left behind as abandoned relics of their own attempts to conquer the land. Most men came here seeking fortune or adventure, but Jack had come to the Rockies for something different: survival. And it was something he had fought for every day since. The fire pit would remain hidden beneath his cabin's floorboards, an unspoken testament to the ingenuity and perseverance that had kept him alive. And while Jack knew that he couldn't outlast the wilderness forever, he understood that each moment he survived was a victory, no matter how small. He paused, taking one final look back at his cabin, his refuge, before turning to face the snow-covered trail ahead. The world might be quieter now, but Jack knew better than to think it was over. It was a constant battle, and in the end, it wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about enduring, about leaving a legacy of resilience in a land where the mountain never stopped testing those who dared to call it home. With a steady breath, Jack set off into the unknown, the fire still burning beneath his feet.